By the spring of 1940, a profound strategic challenge weighed heavily on a mind within the Imperial Japanese Navy. A senior officer, deep in the confines of his cabin aboard the battleship Nagato, found himself considering an action so extreme it could irrevocably shape his nation's destiny. The concept was his own, a calculated response to an anticipated, looming conflict with the United States. He believed, with chilling certainty, that any war with America would demand an immediate, overwhelming blow to offer Japan any hope of survival. This same individual, destined to orchestrate one of history's most audacious surprise assaults, carried a unique burden, a deep, personal understanding of why his own desperate strategy would likely unravel. Years earlier, he had lived among the very people he now considered targeting. Between 1919 and 1921, while officially engaged in language studies at Harvard University, his attention had been drawn elsewhere. He diligently absorbed the intricacies of the American petroleum industry, recognizing it as the indispensable engine of that nation's formidable strength. During his summer breaks, he crisscrossed the country, observing the oil fields of Texas firsthand, gaining an intimate sense of the sheer scale of American industrial power. He was a keen observer of their way of life. Classmates from his time in Cambridge remembered a diligent, inquisitive, and imaginative student. Introduced to the game of poker, he became consumed by it, dedicating entire nights to mastering its nuances. He delved into the mathematical probabilities, the psychological elements of deception, and the critical skill of discerning an opponent's intentions. These card games revealed something about the American character that his military counterparts back home failed to grasp. They were not impulsive, but deliberative. They thought in terms of extended campaigns, accepting temporary setbacks if it meant securing a decisive advantage in the long run. When they held the winning hand, they would press it without mercy. Later, from 1926 to 1928, serving as a naval attaché in Washington, he continued his extensive travels across the United States. He toured automobile plants in Detroit, witnessing assembly lines churning out vehicles at a pace that defied belief. He walked through Pittsburgh's steel mills and the Texas oil refineries, meticulously calculating output figures and production rates. The conclusions he drew from this data filled him with dread. He would later declare that anyone who had truly witnessed the automotive factories in Detroit and the oil fields of Texas would immediately understand that Japan simply lacked the national capacity to engage in a naval arms race with America. During his diplomatic posting, he also continued to play poker with American naval officers, often winning, developing what he described as a disdain for their intellectual nimbleness at the card table. Yet, he never conflated skill in a game with the fundamental character of a nation. He possessed a critical insight that many of his Japanese military colleagues refused to acknowledge. America was neither soft nor inherently weak, and crucially, it would not be compelled to negotiate peace after suffering a single, devastating blow. When Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono sought his opinion on the likelihood of war with the United States, this officer delivered a chillingly accurate forecast. He stated that if compelled to fight, he could achieve an initial period of unchecked success, winning battle after battle for roughly 6 months. Beyond that time frame, however, he held no expectation of victory. He believed that was Japan's absolute limit. After that, he could only foresee defeat. The decisive engagement that effectively crippled Japanese naval power and irrevocably shifted the balance of the Pacific War, the Battle of Midway, unfolded almost precisely 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. His prophecy of ultimate failure proved devastatingly precise. Despite this profound understanding, Japan prepared for war. This is the unfolding narrative of how an entire nation became convinced that Americans were too complacent, too internally divided, and too unwilling to endure hardship to fight for victory. It is the story of how ingrained racial stereotypes, cultural arrogance, and dangerous wishful thinking led Japan's leaders to profoundly misinterpret the character of the nation they were about to provoke. And it details how this catastrophic miscalculation ultimately cost Japan everything. The seeds of Japan's profound misjudgment were sown decades before the strike at Pearl Harbor. In a past triumph that persuaded military planners they had discovered the definitive method for defeating a more powerful adversary. In 1904, Japan initiated a sudden assault on the Russian Pacific Fleet anchored at Port Arthur, marking the beginning of the Russo-Japanese War. The echoes of Pearl Harbor were striking, an unannounced attack without a formal declaration, a crippling blow against an enemy fleet caught unaware, and the neutralization of naval power before a full mobilization could occur. And in that instance, it worked. Over the subsequent year, Japan achieved victory after victory against Russia. On land, Japanese forces captured Port Arthur after a brutal siege that exacted a heavy toll on both sides. At Mukden, in what was then the most prolonged land battle in modern history, Japanese troops outmaneuvered the Russian army, seizing the city. The climax arrived in May 1905 at the Battle of Tsushima, where Admiral Togo Hayakuro virtually annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet. Russia's 2nd Pacific Squadron had endured over 7 months and 18,000 nautical miles, traveling from the Baltic Sea to reach Asian waters. They arrived exhausted, critically undersupplied, and already demoralized by the news that Port Arthur had fallen. Togo positioned his fleet to execute the classic naval maneuver known as crossing the T against the Russian formation, allowing all Japanese guns to bear while only the leading Russian vessels could offer resistance. The result was a rout. Russia lost all 11 of its battleships, 7 sunk and 4 captured, along with numerous smaller ships, and over 5,000 men killed or taken prisoner. Japan, by contrast, lost only 3 torpedo boats and 117 sailors. The Russian admiral, Zinovy Rozhestvensky, was captured. The victorious Admiral Togo, appearing in civilian clothes, visited him in the hospital and offered words of consolation, stating that defeat was a common fate for soldiers and nothing to be ashamed of. The true measure was whether they had fulfilled their duty. This gesture of chivalry, however, obscured a starker reality. Japan had prevailed not through superior valor or spiritual fortitude, but through shrewd positioning, better intelligence, and an enemy already weakened by its arduous, protracted journey. It represented the most decisive naval victory since Trafalgar. More profoundly, it was the first instance in modern history where a non-Western power had triumphed over a major European nation in wartime. The Treaty of Portsmouth, mediated by American President Theodore Roosevelt, brought the conflict to an end. Japan acquired control of Korea, the Liaodong Peninsula, and the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Russia, humiliated and grappling with internal unrest, accepted the terms. Japanese military strategists extracted a lesson from this victory that would shadow them for decades. A sudden assault on enemy naval forces, followed by swift military successes, could compel a larger power to negotiate rather than engage in a prolonged conflict. This interpretation proved fundamentally flawed. Russia had been internally fractured, its resources stretched across 2 continents, fighting thousands of miles from its industrial base. Japan's victory owed as much to Russian weakness as it did to Japanese strength. Yet, the Japanese remembered only the triumph. Tsushima became their blueprint for confronting stronger adversaries. Strike first, strike hard, and the enemy will invariably seek terms. They would attempt to apply this very strategy against America. It would utterly fail. Japan's misjudgment of American resolve originated from a deeper source than mere strategic analysis. It stemmed from a pervasive contempt. Throughout the 1930s, Japanese military leaders observed the Western democracies with growing disdain, perceiving weakness at every turn. Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, Germany's remilitarization of the Rhineland and subsequent annexation of Austria, and Japan's own invasion of Manchuria in 1931, followed by full-scale war against China in 1937. All were met with protests, condemnations, and ineffective sanctions, but never outright military intervention from the West. Japanese leaders concluded that democracies simply lacked the will for sustained warfare. They believed that nations prioritizing individual rights and comfort could never equal Japan's spirit of self-sacrifice, where duty to the emperor superseded all personal concerns. The Japanese military held an unshakable conviction in their own people's willingness to make any sacrifice for the nation. They held equal contempt for what they saw as the fragility of American and European democracies, where loyalty and patriotism seemed diluted by a focus on individual well-being and legal protections. This contempt was further bolstered by a racialized worldview deeply embedded within Japanese military culture. Many Japanese officers maintained that Americans were inherently inferior warriors, too accustomed to luxury and ease to endure the rigors of prolonged conflict. They cited America's isolationist political stance, its deeply divided public opinion regarding foreign entanglements, and its apparent hesitation to fight as undeniable proof of national weakness. A Japanese military assessment from 1941, for instance, concluded that the American populace valued luxury above all, that their culture was shallow and devoid of true meaning, and that they consequently lacked the spiritual fortitude for sustained warfare. It was a catastrophic distortion of the American character. The naval officer who had lived in America attempted to dismantle this dangerous illusion. In a speech, he cautioned that many mistakenly viewed Americans as weak and indulgent, but this, he insisted, was a grave error. He warned that any attack would be met by American determination and fury. His words went unheeded. There was one final calculation Japanese leaders made before Pearl Harbor. They believed that even if America did respond with force, its immense industrial capacity would require years to fully mobilize. This, they reasoned, would grant Japan sufficient time to solidify its conquests, establish an impregnable defensive perimeter across the Pacific, and ultimately compel America to accept a negotiated settlement rather than embark on a protracted war to reclaim distant islands. This assumption, too, was gravely mistaken. While Japan's military planners acknowledged in abstract terms America's colossal industrial potential, internal Imperial Navy studies in 1941 clearly charted the very trends in American shipbuilding that would eventually overwhelm Japan. They convinced themselves that the democratic system rendered this potential irrelevant. They were certain that American workers would resist wartime sacrifices, that labor disputes would paralyze factories, that a gridlocked Congress would obstruct mobilization efforts, and that the American public would demand peace rather than endure years of rationing and mounting casualties. They gambled that Americans would prioritize comfort over decisive victory. In 1939, American military aircraft production barely exceeded 3,000 planes annually. Adolf Hitler's advisors dismissed President Roosevelt's call for 50,000 aircraft per year as mere propaganda, an impossible target. Yet, by 1944, American factories were turning out nearly 100,000 aircraft each year. The United States produced more planes in 1944 alone than Japan manufactured during the entire duration of the war. Japanese planners had accurately identified America's industrial might. They simply refused to believe a democratic society could actually harness it. On July 26, 1941, American President Franklin Roosevelt initiated a severe economic measure, freezing all Japanese assets within the United States. Britain and the Dutch East Indies quickly followed suit, enacting similar restrictions within days. The immediate catalyst for this action was Japan's recent occupation of French Indochina. On July 24th, with France under German occupation, the Vichy government had consented to Japanese military bases being established in the colony. Japanese forces rapidly moved into Cam Ranh Naval Base, a strategic position just 800 miles from the American-held Philippines and a direct threat to the British base at Singapore. Roosevelt's response was swift and uncompromising. The asset freeze transcended mere trade limitations. It effectively severed all commercial ties between Japan and the United States. Japanese bank accounts became inaccessible, ships in American ports were prevented from loading cargo, and long-standing contracts were nullified. Decades of trade ceased overnight. When Britain and the Dutch East Indies aligned with the American stance, the combined effect was devastating for Japan. The nation suddenly lost access to three-quarters of its overseas trade and a staggering 88% of its imported oil. The statistics were stark. Japan sourced most of its oil from the United States. Without American oil, Japan's existing reserves could sustain normal operations for perhaps 3 years. Under the relentless demands of wartime, with ships and aircraft consuming fuel at accelerated rates, that estimate plummeted to 18 months or less. The Japanese Navy informed Emperor Hirohito that oil reserves would be depleted within 2 years if new sources were not secured. Army planners calculated that their mechanized divisions would be immobilized even sooner. Japan's military leadership faced an agonizing choice. They could comply with American demands, withdraw from China, and relinquish their imperial ambitions. Or they could embark on a war to seize the vital oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and the broader resources of Southeast Asia. For the militarists who wielded dominant influence within the Japanese government, a retreat from China was unthinkable. It would signify an admission that 4 years of conflict and hundreds of thousands of casualties had been utterly wasted. It would trigger political disgrace and likely lead to the collapse of the government. They chose war instead. The military presented the conflict not as an option, but as an inescapable necessity. Japan, they argued, was being suffocated. The only alternative to war was a slow economic decline and the abandonment of every achievement Japan had fought for. What they deliberately omitted was an honest appraisal of what true victory would actually demand. The naval officer, Isoroku Yamamoto, uniquely understood the true cost of victory against America. In a letter intended as a stark warning against war, he asserted that mere conquests of Guam and the Philippines, or even Hawaii and San Francisco, would be insufficient. To ensure triumph, he stated, Japan would need to march into Washington and dictate terms of peace within the White House itself. He openly questioned whether Japan's politicians truly possessed confidence in such a final outcome. His words were a grim caution about the impossibility of achieving a genuine, lasting victory. Japanese militarists later deliberately truncated this quotation, twisting it to sound like a boast. He was not being rhetorical. He was articulating a fundamental strategic truth. America was not Russia. Its industrial heartland was shielded by 2 vast oceans. Its population was immense, and its natural resources were virtually limitless. This he knew from personal observation. He had traversed American oil fields and automobile factories, had seen the assembly lines in motion, and counted the derricks. He understood that any war with America extending beyond a year or 2 would inevitably culminate in Japanese defeat. Regardless of the brilliance or ferocity of Japanese forces, he also recognized that his nation had already committed its course. His earlier warning to Prime Minister Kono had been disregarded. Japan would fight, and he would fulfill his duty, all the while knowing that time was inherently against them. He conceived the Pearl Harbor operation not as a path to win the war, but as a desperate gamble to buy time. If Japan could cripple the American Pacific Fleet and secure a defensive perimeter before American industrial might could fully awaken, perhaps, just perhaps, America would opt for negotiation rather than a prolonged struggle to reclaim distant Pacific outposts. It was a slender hope. He understood its fragility, but his superiors dismissed his warnings about the catastrophic consequences should that gamble fail. At 7:55 on the morning of December 7th, 1941, the first wave of Japanese aircraft emerged over Pearl Harbor. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda spearheaded the attack force, leading the initial assault. As the squadron approached Oahu, he observed no American fighters rising to engage, no defensive anti-aircraft fire reaching skyward, no indication that the Americans anticipated an attack. He transmitted the code phrase Tora, 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 signifying complete surprise, back to the waiting carriers. Over the next 2 hours, 353 aircraft launched from 6 Japanese carriers descended upon the American Pacific Fleet at anchor. They arrived in 2 distinct waves, the first at 7:55 a.m. and the second at 8:50 a.m. Torpedo planes skimmed just above the water's surface, releasing their weapons against the battleships moored along Ford Island. Dive bombers plunged from high altitudes, delivering their ordnance onto decks and into aircraft hangars. Horizontal bombers released their payloads from great height, while fighters strafed anything that moved below. The primary targets were Battleship Row, where the Pacific Fleet's most formidable vessels lay in neat formation along the southeastern shore of Ford Island. Hickam Field and Wheeler Field, the main Army air bases, were also struck to prevent American aircraft from mounting a response. The Ford Island Naval Air Station was targeted to eliminate patrol planes that might track the retreating Japanese carriers. The resulting devastation was severe. The battleship Arizona suffered multiple bomb strikes within the opening minutes of the attack. One armor-piercing bomb, a modified 16-inch naval shell, penetrated the deck near Turret 2 and ignited in the forward magazine, where over 1 million pounds of gunpowder were stored. The explosion was cataclysmic. A towering fireball erupted from the Arizona, visible for miles, obliterating the ship's forward section. The vessel sank to the harbor floor in under 9 minutes, claiming the lives of 1,177 of her crew, nearly half of all American fatalities that day. Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd and Captain Franklin van Valkenburg both perished at their stations, directing their ship's defense amidst the inferno until the magazine exploded. The Oklahoma capsized after being struck by numerous torpedoes on her port side, rolling completely over and trapping hundreds of sailors within her hull. Rescue workers could hear desperate tapping from inside the ship for days after the attack, but most could not be reached in time. 429 men died aboard the Oklahoma. The California, West Virginia, and Nevada, along with other battleships, were either sunk or severely damaged. The West Virginia settled upright on the harbor bottom after absorbing 7 torpedo hits and 2 bomb strikes. The California slowly submerged over 3 days despite frantic efforts to save her. The Nevada managed to get underway during the assault, attempting to escape the harbor, but was ultimately ordered to beach herself rather than risk sinking in the narrow channel and blocking the entire port. By the time the last Japanese aircraft departed shortly after 9:30, more than 2,400 Americans were dead. Nearly 20 ships had been sunk or put out of action. 188 aircraft lay in ruins, most destroyed on the ground before they could even attempt to defend. The Japanese pilots returned to their carriers triumphant. They had achieved complete surprise, inflicted massive casualties, and sustained minimal losses themselves. Only 29 aircraft and 5 submarines. The operation had exceeded all expectations. Yet, a critical misstep had occurred. The American aircraft carriers, the most pivotal vessels in the fleet, were not in port that day. The Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island. The Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway. The Saratoga was undergoing repairs in San Diego. The Japanese had sunk battleships, powerful symbols from a previous era of naval warfare, but the carriers that would decide the fate of the Pacific War remained untouched. The attackers had also failed to destroy crucial infrastructure. The fuel storage tanks at Pearl Harbor contained 4.5 million barrels of oil, enough to sustain the Pacific Fleet's operations for months. A focused assault on these tanks would have crippled American capabilities far more effectively than sinking battleships. The dry docks and repair facilities were also largely intact. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier force, made the decision not to launch a third strike. His pilots had accomplished their primary mission. The element of surprise was gone, and American defenders were now fully alert and fighting back fiercely. Nagumo was concerned about the location of the American carriers and was unwilling to risk his precious fleet carriers to a potential counterattack. He withdrew, leaving behind a devastated harbor, but critically, also an untouched industrial base, intact fuel supplies, and the very carriers that would soon begin to retaliate. And there was something else the Japanese had failed to destroy, something that would prove far more significant than any vessel. They had not broken American resolve. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was intended to shatter American morale and persuade the American public that a war with Japan would be too costly to pursue. It achieved precisely the opposite effect. Prior to December 7th, American public opinion regarding the war was deeply fractured. While most Americans sympathized with the Allied cause, they harbored no desire to send their sons to fight in foreign conflicts. Isolationist sentiment remained powerful. Polls indicated that despite increasing support for Britain, the overwhelming majority of Americans opposed direct military involvement. The attack on Pearl Harbor galvanized the nation overnight. Within 24 hours of President Roosevelt's address to Congress, in which he declared December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, the Senate voted unanimously for war, 82-0. The House of Representatives followed suit with a vote of 388-1, with pacifist Jeanette Rankin of Montana casting the sole dissenting vote. The America First Committee, the most influential isolationist organization in the country, disbanded within days. Before Pearl Harbor, Americans debated whether the war was even their concern. After Pearl Harbor, 16 million Americans ultimately served in uniform. Japanese planners had anticipated that the shock of Pearl Harbor would deter American resistance. Instead, it ignited a fury that would only be appeased by Japan's unconditional surrender. "Remember Pearl Harbor" became the rallying cry of a unified nation. Every American knew someone who had died in the attack, knew someone who had enlisted to avenge it, or would soon join the fight themselves. The unannounced strike, delivered before a formal declaration of war, convinced Americans that Japan was not merely an enemy, but a treacherous one that required absolute defeat. The Japanese had awakened precisely what their own naval strategists had feared. They had united a divided nation and imbued it with a terrible resolve. The first clear indication of Japan's fundamental miscalculation arrived just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, from an entirely unexpected quarter. On April 18, 1942, 16B, 25 Mitchell bombers launched from the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet, some 650 miles from the Japanese coast. This marked the first time medium bombers had ever been launched from an aircraft carrier, and the air crews held no expectation of returning to the ship. Their mission was to bomb targets in Japan and then proceed to airfields in China. Leading the raid was Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a 45-year-old former racing pilot and aviation pioneer holding a doctorate in aeronautics from MIT, who had volunteered to personally command the strike he had helped plan. The raiders trained in absolute secrecy for weeks, practicing short takeoffs to simulate carrier deck launches. Each 5-man crew carried 4 500-pound bombs, 3 high explosive and 1 incendiary, with targets encompassing military and industrial facilities in Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. The mission almost failed before it began. Early on the morning of April 18th, a Japanese patrol boat sighted the American task force and managed to radio a contact report before being sunk. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the carrier force, faced a difficult decision. The original plan called for launching the bombers at dusk for 100 miles from Japan to allow them to arrive over their targets at night and reach China in daylight. But with Japanese forces now alerted, every hour of delay magnified the risk of the carriers themselves being attacked. Halsey ordered Doolittle to launch immediately, 200 miles farther from Japan than initially planned and in broad daylight. Doolittle's B-25 was the first to lift off the deck at 8:20 a.m., followed by the other 15 aircraft over the next hour. Each crew understood that the early launch meant they lacked sufficient fuel to reach their designated landing sites in China. They would have to ditch in the ocean, bail out over Japanese-occupied territory, or desperately hope to reach Chinese lines before their tanks ran dry. All 16 aircraft reached Japan and struck their targets. Doolittle himself bombed an aircraft factory in Tokyo. Other crews hit steel mills, oil tank farms, and various military installations. Anti-aircraft fire was scattered, and Japanese fighters responded slowly, having expected any attack to originate from carriers much closer to the coast. The physical damage inflicted was minimal. Initial Japanese reports cited 12 killed and over 100 wounded. A handful of structures were destroyed. One bomber caused minor damage to the light carrier Ryuho at Yokosuka, slightly delaying its completion. In terms of military impact, the raid was negligible. However, its psychological repercussions were enormous. The Japanese military had assured the public that the home islands were invulnerable. The emperor's person was sacred, and his capital was supposedly protected by an impenetrable ring of defenses. Now, American bombers had appeared over Tokyo itself, dropping bombs on the imperial capital in broad daylight. The emperor's own palace had been exposed to danger. The armed forces had suffered an immense loss of face. Civilian buildings and schools had been hit, proving unequivocally that Japan was not safe from American retribution. For the Japanese public, the raid shattered the illusion of invincibility. For the Japanese military, it demanded a decisive response. The operation that would later become the Battle of Midway was accelerated, in part, to prevent future raids by expanding Japan's defensive perimeter. The humiliation of the Doolittle raid profoundly influenced Japanese strategic planning for months afterward. The naval officer's letter to a colleague after the raid captured his astute understanding of American psychology. He wrote that Britain and America might have initially underestimated Japan, but from their perspective, it felt like being severely bitten by a dog they had been feeding. America, he observed, was now unequivocally determined to launch full-scale operations against Japan. He also noted that the thoughtless celebrations in Japan following Pearl Harbor were deplorable, making him fear that the first attack on Tokyo would cause the Japanese public to collapse instantly. He understood, as his fellow leaders did not, that the raid's true significance lay not in the bombs themselves, but in its demonstration of American resolve. The Americans were coming, and they would not cease until they reached Tokyo itself. Of the 80 crew members who flew the raid, 3 were killed during crash landings or while parachuting. 8 were captured by the Japanese. 3 of these prisoners were executed by firing squad, and 1 died from disease and mistreatment in captivity. The remaining 4 endured over 3 years of solitary confinement before being liberated at the war's end. The rest of the raiders reached China, either crash landing or bailing out when their fuel was exhausted. Chinese civilians and soldiers, often at terrible personal cost, helped many escape to safety. The Japanese army retaliated with a brutal campaign across the Chinese provinces where the Americans had landed, slaughtering an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians in reprisal. Doolittle himself, convinced the mission had failed because none of his aircraft could be recovered, expected to face court-martial. Instead, he was promoted to brigadier general and awarded the Medal of Honor. The raid, which had inflicted minimal physical damage, had achieved something far more valuable. It proved Japan was vulnerable, and America was prepared to take enormous risks to strike back. Almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese combined fleet, the largest naval force Japan had ever assembled, steamed toward Midway Atoll. The naval officer's plan was intricate and ambitious. He would dispatch a diversionary force to attack the Aleutian Islands, drawing American attention northward. Concurrently, the primary striking force would approach Midway from the northwest. After carrier aircraft neutralized the island's defenses, an invasion force would land and secure the atoll. The true objective was not Midway itself, but the American carriers. He believed that once America learned of the direct threat to Midway, strategically positioned between Hawaii and Japan, their remaining carriers would sortie to defend it. The powerful Japanese fleet would then lie in wait, ready to annihilate them. He committed 4 fleet carriers to this operation: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same vessels that had attacked Pearl Harbor, crewed by Japan's most seasoned pilots. He also deployed 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, including the immense Yamato, and dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and support ships. Against this formidable armada, the Americans could muster only 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The Yorktown had suffered severe damage just a month prior at the Battle of the Coral Sea, and Pearl Harbor Navy Yard workers, initially told repairs would take 3 months, accomplished the task in a mere 72 hours of relentless labor. America had no battleships available, The surviving vessels from Pearl Harbor were still undergoing repairs or serving in the Atlantic. The American force comprised only 8 cruisers and 18 destroyers. On paper, the outcome should have been a decisive Japanese victory. However, American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii had cracked enough of the Japanese naval code to identify the target and approximate timing of the operation. Commander Joseph Rockefort and his team worked around the clock, analyzing intercepted messages. They couldn't decipher everything, but they could read enough. A clever deception confirmed Midway as the target. The codebreakers suspected the Japanese designation AF referred to Midway, but needed proof. They arranged for the base at Midway to broadcast an unencrypted radio message reporting a breakdown in their water purification system. Within 48 hours, American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese message stating that AF was short of water. Admiral Chester Nimitz now knew Midway was the objective, understood approximately when the attack would occur, and positioned his carriers to ambush the ambushers at a location optimistically dubbed Point Luck. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, Japanese aircraft struck Midway while American dive bombers hunted for the Japanese carriers. After hours of confusion and failed attacks, everything changed in a chaotic 5 minutes. At 10:25 that morning, dive bombers from the Enterprise in Yorktown located the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu with their decks fully loaded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Within minutes, all 3 carriers were burning hulks. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, was found and destroyed that afternoon. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, and over 300 aircraft. More critically, Japan lost hundreds of its most experienced pilots, men who had dedicated years to perfecting carrier operations and could not be quickly replaced. The American losses were significant. The carrier Yorktown and a destroyer were sunk, and over 300 American sailors perished. But the strategic outcome was undeniable. The naval officer's grim prediction had materialized. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan's offensive capability was irrevocably broken. The Imperial Navy would never again pose a credible threat to Hawaii or the American mainland. From Midway onward, Japan would fight defensively to hold what it had already conquered, while America's industrial machine was just beginning its full output. In August 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. This marked the first major offensive operation of the Pacific War and served as the initial test of whether American ground forces could match Japanese soldiers in sustained combat. The landings on August 7th caught the Japanese by surprise. The 1st Marine Division, under the command of Major General Alexander Vandegrift, quickly secured an airfield that the Japanese had been constructing. Within weeks, American engineers completed the runway, naming it Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed leading his squadron at Midway. For the subsequent 6 months, the fighting never ceased. The Japanese leadership could not accept the loss of Guadalcanal. The island sat squarely across the supply routes between America and Australia. If held by the Americans, it would imperil Japanese positions throughout the South Pacific. The Imperial General Headquarters ordered the island retaken at any cost. Japanese forces repeatedly assaulted Henderson Field by land, by sea, and from the air. The Marines and later Army soldiers repelled attack after relentless attack. The names of these engagements, Alligator Creek, Edson's Ridge, the Matanacaw, Henderson Field itself, became legendary within Marine Corps history. At sea, the conflict was equally brutal. 7 major naval battles raged in the waters surrounding Guadalcanal, leading to so many ship losses that the area between Guadalcanal and Florida Island became grimly known as Iron Bottom Sound. The Japanese devised the Tokyo Express, high-speed destroyer runs that delivered troops and supplies under the cover of darkness. American aircraft from Henderson Field made daytime operations suicidal for them, so the Japanese came at night. Both sides suffered ship losses at a rate neither could possibly sustain. The jungle warfare was merciless. Malaria debilitated thousands of men on both sides. Tropical diseases, dysentery, and infections from even minor wounds claimed nearly as many lives as enemy action. The heat was stifling, the terrain unforgiving, and fresh water desperately scarce. Supply lines were tenuous at best. Marines who had anticipated a brief campaign found themselves locked in a death struggle that dragged on month after month. They ate Japanese rations when their own ran out, wore rotting uniforms, and went weeks without adequate rest. They fought Japanese soldiers who had been indoctrinated to believe that surrender was worse than death, and who attacked with a ferocity American troops had never before encountered. But when the fighting finally subsided in February 1943, Japan had sustained another defeat it could not afford. The Japanese lost over 14,000 killed in action, 9,000 to disease, and 1,000 captured. They lost 38 ships and over 600 aircraft. More crucially, they forfeited the strategic initiative. Never again would Japanese forces attempt a major offensive in the Pacific. Perhaps as significant as the military victory was the psychological one. On an equal footing, American ground forces had bested Japan's elite. The myth of Japanese invincibility on land, forged in Malaya and the Philippines, was shattered, and the production disparity that the naval officer had warned about was becoming undeniably apparent. While Japan and America grappled on Guadalcanal, American factories achieved production feats that Japanese planners had deemed impossible. When President Roosevelt demanded 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943, Hitler's advisors dismissed these figures as mere propaganda. American military production in 1939 offered no indication that such targets could ever be met. The entire U.S. military possessed fewer than 3,000 aircraft. The idea of producing 50,000 planes annually seemed like a fantasy. But American industry transformed itself with a speed and on a scale that astonished the world. Before the war, American automobile manufacturers competed fiercely to produce cars and trucks for civilian consumers. After Pearl Harbor, they converted to war production almost overnight. The Ford Motor Company, which had previously built automobiles at a rate of one every 69 seconds, completely reoriented its operations. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, designed by architect Albert Kahn and constructed with incredible speed, eventually produced B-24 Liberator bombers using assembly line principles never before applied to aircraft manufacturing. By the war's conclusion, Willow Run was assembling bombers faster than any factory globally, turning out one complete aircraft every 63 minutes. Shipyards expanded at a similar, relentless pace. Gulf Shipbuilding in Alabama grew from 240 employees at the start of 1940 to 11,600 by 1943. Alabama dry dock swelled from 1,000 workers to nearly 30,000. Henry Kaiser's shipyards pioneered new construction techniques that reduced the time required to build a Liberty ship from months to mere days. His workers could assemble a complete vessel in under 2 weeks. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. By 1944, women comprised over a third of the defense manufacturing workforce, operating lathes and welding torches, assembling aircraft and ammunition, driving trucks, and operating cranes. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter became a potent symbol of American determination. The results were staggering. By 1943, American shipyards were launching more tonnage in a single year than Japan had produced throughout the entire war up to that point. By autumn 1943, all Allied shipping loss since 1939 had been replaced and even surpassed. The German U-boat campaign, which had threatened to strangle Britain, was overwhelmed by sheer production volume. American factories produced almost two-thirds of all Allied military equipment, including 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million Army trucks. By 1944, more than half of all global industrial production was centered in the United States. In 1943 alone, the United States manufactured nearly 30,000 tanks, more in a single year than Germany produced from 1939 to 1945. American factories churned out 100 million tons of war equipment over the course of the conflict. The disparity in carrier construction vividly illustrated this imbalance. In the 3 years following Midway, Japan built 6 aircraft carriers. America built 17. This figure, however, understates the true advantage. American carriers were larger, carried more aircraft, and were supported by vast fleets of supply ships, tankers, and repair vessels that enabled them to operate thousands of miles from home ports for months on end. These numbers told a story that Japanese leaders had stubbornly refused to believe. They had gambled that democracy would inherently prevent America from effectively mobilizing its resources. They had assumed that labor disputes, political divisions, and public demand for consumer goods would preclude a full conversion to war production. They were catastrophically wrong. American civilians accepted rationing of gasoline, rubber, sugar, coffee, meat, and dozens of other commodities. They purchased war bonds by the billions. They worked extended hours without complaint. They sent their sons and daughters to war. The democracy that Japanese leaders had dismissed as fragile proved capable of sacrifices that matched or exceeded those of any totalitarian state. As American production surged and Japanese forces steadily retreated across the Pacific, Japanese pilots began reporting something profoundly unsettling. The Americans were fighting differently, not merely with superior numbers of ships and planes, but with a greater skill and an unwavering determination that Japanese military doctrine had considered impossible. Japanese military training stressed spiritual strength and warrior spirit as the decisive factors in combat. They believed that American soldiers, nurtured in a soft, democratic society, would lack the necessary will to close with the enemy and fight to the death. Instead, they encountered Marines who charged machine gun positions, pilots who pressed attacks through walls of anti-aircraft fire, and sailors who battled fiercely on burning ships until they sank beneath them. The Japanese had made a fundamental error. They had confused America's reluctance to engage in war with an inability to fight it. The isolationism of the 1930s was not cowardice. It was a democratic nation deliberating whether distant conflicts justified American lives. Once that debate was brutally resolved by the attack on Pearl Harbor, America fought with precisely the fury that the naval officer had predicted. The democracy that had appeared divided and complacent before December 7th became unified and ferocious afterward. Japanese commanders discovered that American forces would not negotiate local surrenders, would not accept compromise peace terms, and would not stop until total victory was achieved. The war that Japan had initiated with a surprise attack would conclude only with Japan's unconditional surrender. On April 18, 1943, precisely 1 year after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, American P-38 fighters intercepted a transport aircraft over Bougainville Island. Aboard that aircraft was Admiral Isuke Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the prophet who had foretold Japan's defeat, and the commander of the combined fleet. American codebreakers had intercepted and deciphered his flight plans. A specially planned mission was launched to eliminate him. The P-38s shot down both bombers in Yamamoto's flight. His body was discovered the following day, still clutching his ceremonial sword. Yamamoto's death dealt a significant blow to Japanese morale. He was respected and admired throughout the Navy, one of the few leaders who commanded genuine loyalty rather than fearful obedience. His loss removed from Japanese councils the one voice that had consistently warned against underestimating America. But by April 1943, his warnings had already been tragically validated. Japan was firmly on the defensive across the Pacific. Its carrier force was crippled. Its most experienced pilots were gone. The industrial tide that he had predicted was beginning to overwhelm Japan's military. The man who had understood America better than any other Japanese leader, who had tirelessly tried to warn his nation against a war he knew it could not win, died knowing that his direst predictions were becoming reality. Over the subsequent 2 years, American forces island-hopped across the Pacific, each campaign bringing them closer to Japan. The strategy was deliberate. Rather than assaulting every Japanese-held island, American commanders identified key positions that could be captured and then utilized as staging areas for further advances. Islands incapable of supporting air bases or anchorages were bypassed, their Japanese garrisons left to slowly wither without fresh supplies or purpose. The Gilbert Islands fell in November 1943. Tarawa, a tiny atoll defended by nearly 5,000 Japanese soldiers, cost the Marines over 1,000 killed and more than 2,000 wounded in just 76 hours of fighting. The Japanese garrison was almost entirely annihilated. Only 17 Japanese soldiers survived as prisoners. The sheer intensity of Japanese resistance shocked both American planners and the American public. The Marshall Islands followed in early 1944. Kwajalein and Eniwetok provided crucial anchorages and airfields, bringing American forces within striking distance of the Mariana Islands. The Marianas Campaign in the summer of 1944 delivered a decisive strategic blow. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam placed American B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. For the first time since the Doolittle raid, Japan faced the terrifying prospect of sustained aerial bombardment. The battle for Saipan lasted 3 weeks, claiming over 3,000 American lives and wounding more than 10,000. The Japanese lost nearly 30,000 soldiers, most of whom chose death over surrender. Hundreds of Japanese civilians, indoctrinated by propaganda that Americans would torture and murder them, committed suicide by leaping from cliffs at the northern end of the island. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, Marines fought for 36 grueling days to capture an island barely 8 square miles in area. The Japanese had fortified the volcanic rock with an intricate network of tunnels, bunkers, and interconnected defensive positions that transformed every yard of advance into a brutal engagement. Nearly 7,000 Americans died on Iwo Jima, and another 19,000 were wounded. The Japanese garrison of approximately 21,000 soldiers was virtually annihilated. Only about 200 were taken as prisoners of war. The rest perished, defending an island whose only strategic value lay in its airfields. At Okinawa, the fighting persisted for almost 3 months, costing over 12,000 American lives. The Japanese deployed kamikaze aircraft in mass attacks for the first time, sinking or damaging dozens of American ships. The civilian population of Okinawa suffered terribly, caught between American bombardment and Japanese soldiers who sometimes used them as human shields or coerced them into suicide. These staggering casualties were precisely what Japanese strategy had relied upon. The militarists had believed that if they made victory sufficiently costly, Americans would demand peace rather than continue the slaughter. Instead, each bloody victory only reinforced American resolve to complete the task. Polls demonstrated that American public support for the war remained overwhelming, even as casualty lists grew ever longer. By the summer of 1945, American B-29 bombers were systematically reducing Japanese cities to ashes. The firebombing of Tokyo in March alone killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night. The home islands, which Japanese leaders had promised were inviolable, were burning. And yet, Japan continued to fight, even as its cities lay in ruins and its people starved, because the militarists who had initiated the war could not bring themselves to acknowledge its loss. The atomic bombs that devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 finally compelled Japan's surrender. But the ultimate outcome had been sealed years earlier, rooted in the fundamental miscalculation that led Japan to strike Pearl Harbor. Japanese leaders had been convinced that Americans were weak, that democracy inherently enfeebled nations, and that industrial potential meant nothing without the spiritual will to employ it. They had believed that a surprise attack would shatter American morale rather than galvanize it. They were profoundly mistaken about every assumption. 16 million Americans served in uniform during World War II. American factories outproduced all other combatants combined. a nation that Japanese planners had dismissed as too divided and too comfortable to fight, endured the bloodiest conflict in human history until total victory was achieved. The miscalculation that prompted Pearl Harbor was not merely military. It was deeply cultural. Japanese leaders had observed American society and perceived only what they expected to see. They saw jazz music in Hollywood films and inferred decadence. They observed labor unions and political debates and presumed weakness. They witnessed a nation hesitant to go to war and concluded it was afraid to fight. They failed to comprehend that America's reluctance to engage came not from weakness, but from the process of democratic deliberation. And they failed to understand that once that deliberation was forcefully concluded by Japanese bombs, America would fight with a determination that matched or exceeded anything Japan could muster. The naval officer understood. He had lived in America, played poker with American officers, traveled across the American heartland. He knew that the image of soft, weak Americans was a perilous delusion. But his insights were overridden by men who had never set foot in the United States, who based their strategic assumptions on racial stereotypes and wishful thinking. They learned the truth only when it was far too late to alter their course. The war that Japan commenced on December 7, 1941, concluded on September 2, 1945, when Japanese officials affixed their signatures to the instrument of surrender aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The ceremony unfolded on the deck of a vessel named for an American state, beneath the guns representing American industrial might, in the harbor of a Japanese capital that had been largely reduced to rubble. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the proceedings, while representatives from all Allied powers stood silently behind him. The Japanese delegation, in formal morning coats and top hats, appeared rigid and deeply uncomfortable as they signed the documents that brought an end to Japanese imperial aspirations forever. Among the flags displayed on the Missouri was the very flag that had flown over the Capitol building in Washington on December 7, 1941. Another flag present that day was the 31-star flag that Commodore Matthew Perry had carried when he opened Japan to Western trade in 1853. The symbolism was stark. Japan's attempt to construct an empire had ended where, for many, its modern engagement with the West had begun, with American ships in Tokyo Bay. A gentle breeze stirred the flags, and the scratch of a pen filled the momentary silence. Japan's fatal miscalculation, the empire's unheeded warning. As the Pacific plunged toward war, Japanese leaders made a catastrophic judgment, believing American democracy made it too soft to fight. They dismissed warnings from within their own ranks, convinced a single, decisive blow would break American resolve. This profound underestimation of the adversary ignited a chain of events that transformed a reluctant nation into an unstoppable industrial and military force, sealing Japan's fate. The initial triumph at Pearl Harbor concealed the true cost of awakening such a formidable power. Discover more compelling stories from World War II by subscribing to our channel. Hashtag WW2History. Hashtag World War II. Hashtag Military History.